Quick credibility check. My grandmother's, brother killed by terrorists in Iraq. But more importantly, is that Carl is literally doing his master's thesis on this topic. Now, something I want to note that is important for this round is that the burden of opposition is to defend the status quo. A lot of empirics are going to be dropped in this round, and this is the reality that needs to be defended by the opposition bench. Now, we have two large claims for you. One is that this increases the likelihood of war. It empirically has, and it will continue to do so, which is destructive and hurts a lot of people. Secondly, is that terrorist groups become more efficient at the point that they cooperate. So, quick history lesson. In the past few years, there have been two coups in Mali, one in Niger, and two in Burkina Faso. This is because of a failure to contain Al-Qaeda. There is now no more democracy in these states. There have been brutal crackdowns. Many thousands of people have died, and many millions of people have lost all of their rights and are now under the auspices of a brutal military junta. Why does this occur? Structurally. Note that consolidation of these terrorist groups threaten state power in four incredibly important ways. Firstly, Al-Qaeda and associated terrorist groups have a direct interest in forming a Muslim caliph. This is their stated goal, but it is also what they believe the Islamic, culture should be about protecting. They want to bring us back to the glory days, quote unquote, of when the Islamic Empire ruled over kind of the entire Middle East, Northern Africa sort of thing. This is something that they actively have pursued across the Middle East. We've seen this in ISIS, we've seen this in East Africa, we've seen this in Afghanistan, for example. So at the point they're directly threatening the sovereignty of these nations obviously want to fight back. The difference here, of course, is that they're much larger, they're a much more established group, they're much more able to do that. Secondly, is that these large terrorist groups co-opt the use of Islam. In these nations, they often use Islam as a justification for keeping themselves in power. The reason we're in power is because God said this is good. We are the holiest. We have the blessing of all the highest priests and imam and sheikhs in the land. And so that is why we as the ruling class are in power. At the point that there is another party that directly has other sheikhs, imams that also, bless and sponsor their ideology and their form of Islam, this is at the point you have two competing ideologies, two competing views of the religion, and that is another threat to state power. Thirdly, is literally just terrorism. They have done incredibly evil, twisted, fucked up things like beheading people, like bombing public areas. And even if these are small and cause a limited amount of deaths, they still stoke terror and make people feel incredibly scared, which then causes people to fight back. Fourthly, then, is that these groups are much larger now. They exist under the auspices of Al-Qaeda and other large terrorist organizations. Notably, the West and voters in the West understand large groups. They know about Al-Qaeda. They did fucking 9/11, right? They don't know about like the small niche groups in Gabon and Iraq and such. And so the difference is there's a much higher likelihood of foreign intervention. So we've seen in all three coups I referenced in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso that France intervened. What happened when France intervened is that you stoke the tension even further because they go in to end the thing, but then you end up having many more people fighting back, many more people being recruited into these terrorist organizations, and you have a prolonging of the conflict, which we think is much, much worse for them. Why is this much worse than the counterfactual of small, indiscriminate groups? Because I know you might be asking, Humam, these also might threaten state power. Why is this so much different? Well, we've already explained that now it's much larger, the threat is much more apparent, and unlike other sorts of things, you are now attracting foreign actors to come aid the fight and stoke tensions. But there are two other large reasons for why this is much worse. Number one, the smaller terrorist groups that are not consolidated are most often ethnic interest groups within these nations. I want you to think of Hezbollah within Lebanon, for example. This is a group that has a political wing, but also a terrorist associated wing. But notably, they represent Shia interests in different portions of the land. And at that point that they have a legitimized political wing, this means that they have supporters. They have been in the country for many, many, decades. People know who they are. They might have genuine political support within the nation. The difference then is that when you sacrifice this existing, cooperation with the locals in the land, with politicians and the networks that you've built as a small group, also that you can gain power with Al-Qaeda, you also lose kind of that picture feature of being a small interest group that has small, they have maybe a sect of Islam that they want to promote. Rather, you're now seen as the large, scary terrorist group, and that is, obviously much worse. But secondly, of course, is that smaller groups are much more prone to infighting. Smaller groups do not cooperate with each other. They have different schools of thought on what Islam, the proper way to express it is. They have competing interests. They have different territorial, pursuits and claims. They might want money for one sort of terrorist activity. The other group wants money for a different sort of terrorist activity. And so, these are just much less effective groups. They're much less able to actually put up a real big threat to the existing regimes. What happens then? At this point, you've increased the threat to the regimes, and so they crack down in the most brutal manner. Why is this true? Urban fighting is fucking hard. You can't meet terrorists in the field. They often hide themselves in apartment buildings or in residential areas. And you can't have like single person bombs to go in, and it's very difficult and time consuming to go house to house, especially when you're in a region where people are willing to support and hide those terrorists. So you often bomb and destroy those neighborhoods. Note, secondly, that rulers need to maintain legitimacy. They need to signal that they're not weak to their other supporting, keys to power. And so they have to strike hard. They have to strike fast. Thirdly, is that we've seen very often revenge and reprisal killings at the point that some of the military loses some people. They go into a neighborhood, destroy the whole thing. Even if op can prove you get less terrorism, we think that this is small compared to less war overall, less conflict in areas, and less destruction of these nations. Quickly then, on why economies of scale are so bad. Notably, cooperation is very good for terrorism. You can share your research. You can share recruitment effort. You might be able to translate recruitments into different languages. You have money that you can shift from one region to another much more easily. But very importantly, you can source weaponry much easier. You can get rare earth metals from one area and bring them to another area and put them together to make much more destructive and terrible weapons. I think at the point that people put their differences aside and consolidate, they become much more effective, but most notably, they become much more threatening to the regions in Africa and the Middle East, and they become much more likely to be war and conflict and death and destruction. For all of those reasons, do not consolidate.
Okay, just confirming that everyone's ready.
Hello.
Okay, well, I'm gonna plug for a laptop.
Oh, should it work?
You good?
It's
Okay. My time will start in 3, 2, 1. Mom ended his speech by saying, "Do not consolidate." This isn't on me, guys. I'm not consolidating anything. Okay, I'm just saying it's probably better. Okay. Couple of things in my speech. First, responses to what we hear out of OG, and then getting into our case about how consolidation, 1, leads to relative stability in the region, 2, makes counterinsurgency more effective in that people and plans are easier to monitor and target and stop, and 3, why consolidation in and of itself makes these groups less effective. First, responses to OG. So Human pushes on foreign interference, says that counterinsurgency efforts essentially stoke conflict within the region. Note that counterinsurgency efforts happen on both sides of the house for the exact reason that Human talks about, that these leaders need to maintain their stability, or need to maintain their legitimacy within these regions, that they want to defend their homeland. All of these reasons are good reasons why counterinsurgency happens on both sides of the house. Tensions get stoked on both sides of the house. The question then becomes, on which side of the house is counterinsurgency most effectively able to target and stop these terrorist plans when they occur, right? Counterinsurgency also doesn't necessarily mean boots on the ground. Consolidation means that you probably have to fight less like boots on the ground wise and more disrupting of plans, more about like taking care of like defined leadership. We think this is probably the more important realm within where counterinsurgency takes place within this debate. Okay. Okay, I have something written down. It doesn't matter. Okay. Now getting into our case on first on why there's relative stability. So Humam actually talks about this a little bit in his speech, where he says, so what happens in the absence of the consolidation is greater degrees of inter-insurgent violence, right? What this means is that, again, like different insurgent groups are fighting over different locuses of control. They're fighting over resources. They're fighting over territory. What this means is that there are many more people that get caught in the conflict. When it's one unified group, they have far less to fight about, which means far less civilians get caught in the crossfire, right? Why is so when one insurgency group takes power, other insurgency groups that disagree about the scope, that disagree about the methods, or disagree about the reason why we're taking over this area, or the resources or resource allocation, will fight to take control back. What this means is that you get far more fighting in the streets. You get far more fighting over large swaths of territory, right? We think this is where this solely occurs in times where you are where consolidation does not occur. Yes, sorry. Yes, okay. So what we think that the impact of this is that there's greater amounts of violence in the region, that governments fight more, and that there are more brutal tactics used because you have to find advantages wherever you can, right? Which means you have to do things like using the most brutal tactics to try and assert your dominance over an area. This is one of so we think on the comparative, when you have a consolidation of Islamist insurgencies in the Sahel, what you get is probably just far, far, far greater degrees of stability within the region. Yes, there are probably still, I'll take you later. Yes, there are probably still terrorist activities, right? We don't solve for this problem, but we think that there are people that will die in government's world that don't need to on our side of the house. That's what we're defending. The second point that we want to make is that this makes counterinsurgency more effective. How does it do this? Consolidation makes counterinsurgency more effective because you have a more defined leadership structure. Leadership structure. So counterintelligence becomes on individuals becomes easier when there's a defined leadership structure and centralized decision-making apparatus. So the knowledge of individuals that actors can use, these states or Western actors that want to help these states, is probably far, far greater when you've actually defined the leadership structure, who takes care of what, and that this information can then be used to mount counterinsurgent attacks specifically against these individuals or specifically against these plans. Why is it also the case that you're able to easier monitor and target plans? Because there's a more defined you have more defined decision structures that have to go through more layers of bureaucracy. What this means is that you have to relay plans through more actors, which means there's more weak points through which you can intercept these plans and take note of them and be able to centralize a response around them. All of this is to say that it's easier to monitor and target individuals and easier to monitor and target individual plans that these individuals will use to carry out these attacks. We think this is the realm in which you're able to actually have effective counterinsurgency in these cases. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from front.
Terrorists would rather kill infidels. It's haram to kill other Muslims. It's not that they fight between each other, it's that they refuse to cooperate.
I feel like the last history of last 100 years of the Middle East probably means that, I don't know, Muslims killing other Muslims isn't that big of a deal for people. Like, it happens all the time. I don't think you can seriously claim that as the reason why infighting doesn't happen. Okay, thirdly, why does consolidation make these groups less effective? This directly clashes with OG's contention that consolidation makes these groups more effective. Why? One, bureaucracy, right? Because note the counterfactual here is you have more fractured Islamist insurgencies, which one, makes them more dangerous, two, makes them more difficult to mount counterinsurgency efforts against, and three, more difficult to displace, but also just means that they're making decisions all the time in not willy-nilly, but all making different decisions at different points in time that are much more difficult to track. Consolidation makes these groups less effective because there's layers of bureaucracy. Decisions have to go through layers of command. You're less able to just do attacks all the time. There's probably a systematic reason in which attacks are taking place that you can take advantage of for counterinsurgency purposes. Secondly, infighting and politics. While this doesn't happen on the streets, as would happen in government world, what we think happens is that decisions on the methods of attack, decisions on the extent of attack, these are infighting that happens politically within the counterinsurgency group, within the centralized group. All of this is to say that you get far more infighting. So you get far more infighting, which means that makes these groups less effective in the long run, right? Which means you aren't seeing as many attacks on as many points in time. I'll take a POI from back half if you have. Front half? Oh, back.
If there's more bureaucracy and they have slower decision making and there's conflicts within that decision making. Doesn't that mean there's more conflicts and more people fighting?
Yeah, but conflict happens at different points, right? If you have different groups and there's conflict, they probably fight about it because they're fighting over areas, they're fighting over resources, they're fighting over land. If there's disagreement within the centralized organization of the extent of attack, right? This probably doesn't mean to lead to literal violence between people. It probably just leads to fighting within the organization into itself, which means that there are delays. There are times in which this deliberation has to take place because there has to be mediation to keep the group together, right? If the goal is to keep the group together, there has to be mediation and there has to be, okay. So what we've proven to you in this debate is that, one, we think a relative stability that has fewer attacks and more safety for civilians is probably the biggest margin in this debate, and we think we're able to prove that when we get consolidation. Secondly, we think it's easier for counterinsurgency to be effective through monitoring and targeting of individuals and plans. And thirdly, we think consolidation makes these groups inherently less effective, which we think is probably just better for everyone involved. So proud to you for this.
All right, can I be heard and whatnot for online people?
Loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. Okay, beginning in 3, 2, 1. There's two important fact claims you need to know for this debate. The first one is that 51% of global terror deaths were associated with the Sahel. They happened in the Sahel. The second thing you need to know is there have been more deaths associated with security forces killing civilians than there have been terror deaths in the Sahel. Why is this really important? Because we tell you not only do you care about the terrorist groups in this debate, but you care about the response to them. And insofar as we tell you the response to them is worse on their side of the house because it's also just factually true. Let's explain something really quick. They are defending status quo. We don't want to hear any trickery out of the back half like they're defending a different type of consolidation or some bullshit. This is important for this round because when I tell you a bunch of things about the things that have actually happened, that's what they're defending. They can try and prove why it's going to be worse on our side or why the counterfactual that happened like after 2018 would have comparatively been worse. They're going to have a hard time doing it because this is a pretty horrific situation. If you don't like the balance of emotion, take it up with the CAs, not with OG. That's on them. Okay, let's rock. So I'm going to do a couple things for you. Obviously respond, but then I'm also going to talk what exactly these smaller groups look like, what exactly these larger groups look like, and then most importantly, what do these state actors look like and why do they get far worse on their side of the house? So the first thing, let's just go over some quick ref. I'll be really quick on this. One, I think there's just some inherent tension in OO's case where they tell you on one side, consolidated groups are less effective, but they are also easier to target. Why the fuck would you ever consolidate if this was true kind of thing, right? If somehow you're not only worse at doing your job, but you're easier to target. We think that's probably not the case. One, it's unclear to us why you're easier, why this matters. At best, maybe you have regional leaders who are targeted. You're still getting commands from on high. I want to note this is Al-Qaeda. It's an international organization. And the other first group they mentioned is literally ISIS in the Sahel. That's what that is a long, complicated surname for. This matters because those groups are obviously going to still exist no matter how many heads of states you take out, or regional leaders you take out. But not only that, I want to note that on January 5th, 2021, this is real, there was a bombing of a wedding that they claimed was to take out, the French bombed a wedding that they claimed was to take out terrorist head leaders kind of thing. So these are the types of things that happened. What happened after this? You had 2 successive coups in Mali, and then in Burkina Faso, and then finally in Niger. These are also just generally known. If you don't know about the coup in Niger, you just weren't reading the papers in 2023. These are general things that people should know. These were in fact caused by the types of things we're talking about. Why is this really bad? One, it led to the creation of the Association of Sahel States, which is a regional organization. They have left ECOWAS, which is the general broader organization, between Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. Why does this really matter? It matters because they have moved away from France. They have completely distanced themselves and have literally started contracting Wagner. I don't know if you've heard about that particular group, but they're pretty fucking shit when it comes to human rights violations. Why is this really bad? Because insofar as for factual but also structural reasons that our partner tells you, is insofar as the larger, more consolidated organizations present broader violence to, or sorry, broader threats to state sovereignty, they crack down in harsher ways. This looks like Burkina Faso troops forcing civilians to build a trench and then getting killed in a terror attack, which happened less than 6 months ago in Dagaba in Burkina Faso. These are just factually true claims because as your state sovereignty is threatened, you have to crack down. But not only do you have to crack down more, you also have to crack down in worse ways. Why is this the case? Let's talk about these groups. First of all, I want to note the unconsolidated groups were largely ethnic minorities pushing for some degree of autonomy. This looks like the Tuareg in Mali. This looks like the Fulani group in Burkina Faso, who are uniquely interested in having some degree of autonomy because they felt stigmatized and marginalized by central governments of different ethnic groups far away from them. This is really important because these groups weren't just killing their own people randomly. They are ethnically defined groups. One, they have very little incentive to fight each other. It's unclear why the Fulani care that much about the Tuareg who want their own state in Mali, why they would start killing each other. So you have less infighting, which we think is probably good on our side of the house, kind of, or whatever you want to think. They said there's some degree of fighting. But please compare this. And this is where this is the characterization of these smaller groups. They are largely ethnically based. They are largely extremely regionally specific because there are these many ethnic groups that are there are 69 spoken languages in Burkina Faso. These are very specific groups kind of thing. And why this matters is because when larger groups come in, they do not have those ethnic connections, which means they have to rely on violence in order to continue to have rule in these regions. This looks like saying, if we hear about you talking with any of government officials, we kill your family. This looks like threatening you in other ways because they cannot rely on any ethnic ties. Because I hate to tell you, guess what? Al-Qaeda and ISIS aren't actually from fucking like the Sahel region of Africa. They therefore don't have local ties in the same ways, and they're unable to. This is why they were gobbled up by these larger entities again after 2018 because these groups got stronger and continued to consolidate. What this means is that you have more oppressive local regimes. And why does this really matter? Because note a lot of this infighting, some of it happens in cities, but also a lot of it happens in rural, faraway areas. And why this matters for this debate is note that 50 million people have lost democratic rights, civil liberties in these military juntas, which only happened because of the consolidation here. The people who aren't even at threat of terror attacks have lost meaningful things that you should matter about. But there have actively been more deaths post 2018 than pre-18, not just in terrorist terms, but in general terms due to these types of things. So broadly, you probably should not want people to die, which is the counterfactual. Before I continue on, back half, if they have something.
Yeah, was Burkina Faso particularly democratic before the coup?
Actually, it was. So, they had the leader. Like I grew up in Burkina Faso. I tell you, I didn't grow up in like an autocratic regime. It was actually democratic. You had to change an election to Mugabe, and then they moved on to other people, kind of thing. Like, if you want to fact check that, you can. What actually matters about that is all these countries since 2018 have slipped on GMI measurements. They've slipped on all human rights and indicators of all kinds. So they can say, well, were they great? Probably not. They were comparatively better, and that's debate. They need to explain why it is more likely, not only structurally, but for actual like fact claims that matter in the real world. For when CA set a hyper-specific motion, you use hyper-specific knowledge. Like, again, take it up with Reese, not me. I think what matters then is probably really important that they need to explain why it's comparatively worse. We uniquely tell you that these larger groups are more brutal than their tactics for recruitment because they do not have local connections, and also because, I don't know, ISIS likes to make videos of people being beheaded for like international publicity compared to these smaller groups kind of thing. We also tell you that the state actors are now worse off. They are not democratic at all. They are more brutal. They are aligned with states like Russia who care less about these types of things than the MINUSMA mission, which was the UN mission in Mali, which was forced to pull out by these new juntas who said you can no longer operate here. The Burkina Faso Bakaran or France Bakaran mission, which was also forced to leave. If you like civilians being alive, vote for OG.
Nonverbal POIs, please. Also, don't badger me because I'm not. It's just annoying. I'm looking at both of you actually. My time will start in 3, 2, 1. If I hear Carl say factual claim one more time, I'm going to have an aneurysm. Listing statistics is not a fucking case, even if they're like, oh, this is a fact and it's true. You didn't explain, for example, like the direct link to one wedding getting assassinated to a coup. You just say, then the coup happened, therefore causation. I didn't get any actual analysis on the outcome of this, right? Let's then talk about like a bunch of responses, I guess, right? To a certain extent, number one, let's just talk about the idea of like counterinsurgency, like in fighting back against this to a certain extent. First of all, I want to point out that when they talk about the degree to which like it's harder for governments to be able to fight back because if the groups are larger. Note that if there are more groups that are separatized, that are not collectivized, and have not consolidated their power, governments have to pick and choose which groups to target. This means it's much less difficult. It's much more difficult to figure out where to allocate resources, where to allocate military preventions, because you have to make like some type of value judgment on which group is likely going to be more problematic. So it's just much harder to track them and figure out who they are to a certain extent. I don't think I get significant enough pushback from them as to why it is that you don't get like the consolidation of power and the existence of structures of leadership within these organizations it clearly makes it easier for you to be able to understand and identify who the clear threats are. I think on their side of the house, when you have separate groups that are all fighting for different things in different regions because of the ethnic ties that we get out of opening government, it's probably much harder to be able to stop them. And the fact of the matter is they have reasons to fight against each other, right? I think to a certain extent, because of the difference, like I don't know, fucking 69 languages in Burkina Faso, this means there's a lot of cultural ties and cultural differences between the different insurgent groups that function. This means that they are incentivized to try to take power in certain regions, and this means they're much more likely going to fight against each other. So when we talk about the extent to which you have violence against civilian, which is the mechanism by which OG is trying to win, I think you get much more violence when you have multiple different groups that are constantly trying to vie for power, like in regions. This is like, it's also like I'm unclear in a world in which there's like a monopoly of like a consolidated group where they need to use such extreme levels of violence that OG said, because if they have no competition, they have like the people who are like below, like the people that they are trying to gain power over have nowhere else to turn to. So obviously they are likely going to succeed like into the pressure a lot easier. So I think it's quite unlikely that there's going to be extremely high levels of violence from this group, given that they already have a certain degree of power based off what we get out of them generally. But I think it's just generally a lot worse if you have a lot more like shit there. But then Carl says, oh, well, if it's bad, if the reason that the thing is bad, then they wouldn't do it. Like, bro, this is like, it's a debate. Like, obviously we have to argue why it's not going to be effective. Like, the clear differentiation then is that we have physical violence, i.e. like people shooting each other, trying to take land, bombing things like trade routes, compared to conflict within the organization. Note that based on their own characterization about how different ethnic groups have their own things that they're vying for and advocating for, when they're consolidated into one organization, they probably at first think it's a good idea because, oh, yay, we get more power. But then within that, they realize they don't actually have a lot of power because the head Al-Qaeda leaders are making all of the decisions. So this probably leads to a lot of internal conflict, meaning you probably don't get as much effectivity. This leads to a greater degree of government oversight and military capacity to be able to like fight back against them and prevent them based on the analysis that Robert gives you, but how you're able to more effectively stop and prevent plans of bad things happening, right? They say, oh, well, terrorism isn't as bad as like civilians getting killed. Note that it's much easier to identify civilians versus terrorists when you have one large group that is consolidated and has high degrees of power. If you have a bunch of tiny little groups that are all doing different things, who are often hidden and not as well well-defined and circulated, is probably more likely that that military operations are going to be unable to properly target and likely lead to more civilian casualties. We also think that there's a high likelihood of civilian casualties as a result of fighting between different regions. So I'm not necessarily sure on the delta here in the comparative of like military civilian casualties compared to other. At least on our side of the house, you probably get a high degree of casualties of Al-Qaeda, which is probably a good thing because you're limiting the ability of them to like do more harm and like be fucked up in the region and like fuck people over and like do all the like terrible like human rights shit that they're worried about, right? I think that pushback is probably much better on our side of the house, right? What else then? I don't know, man. Like, I think that like I think part of their case is like somewhat self-defeating, right? Because Hamad's giving me all this and I'll take you.
Yeah, so like why does it matter if you're killed by a security force or a terrorist? Surely you just want less deaths. That's probably your main preference. They're obviously still competing up against the state, whereas a vast majority of the deaths happen.
you want less deaths, but if the more deaths are the terrorists that are dying, I would rather like, okay, let me do the math for you here,
Civilians.
okay? So it's like, oh, civilians die on their side of the house. No terrorists die, except for some of them that are fighting against each other. But most of it is just like trying to gain land, trying to gain control over the region, killing civilians that like don't want to opt into or whatever. Versus on our side of the house, you probably just have the fucking military of France or whatever, like assassinating the head of Al-Qaeda, which is probably a good death that you want to happen because it reduces the degree to which they have the ability to kill people in the future, right? I think that some deaths strategically need to happen in order to limit the ability of Al-Qaeda to influence itself and grow in a way that it probably is unlikely going to be able to do. I think another thing is that they're probably just more likely to do like not be like less effective because oftentimes bigger consolidated groups are more overconfident, right? They say, oh, we've kind of wiped out all of our competition in the region. We probably think that we're untouchable, and they're likely going to do louder and riskier things. They're likely to provoke things bigger and more harmfully. The issue then there is that you still have a degree of like lack of collectivization within your movement, such that like there are still a bunch of groups that used to be separate that still have their own belief systems that are probably not always going to always going to like agree with everything that's happening. This means this means that this coalition, or whatever the fuck it's called, is susceptible to a lot of holes and weaknesses, given the size of it, given the extent to which people are likely going to defect if they feel as though the Islamic leadership, the leadership of Al-Qaeda, is not giving proper representation to the JNIM like values and like the opinions of what they want to do. I think when you have those links, when you have those holes, it is much easier to be able to infiltrate and gain access to information, which is much better at decoupling and preventing the growth or like insurgence of Al-Qaeda in the status quo. Because I think on their side of the house, like you just have more groups, like even if you can like get rid of one group, more groups pop up over and over again, right? I think when you have it in the one place and you limit its ability to grow and do things, it's kind of gets like you chop off the legs and they have nothing else to do, right? Like a fun little anecdote is like, oh, like I would rather like kill a wolf than like 1,000 snakes, because like even if the wolf is like bigger and badder, like it is, yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Point being, I think at the end of this debate, I am unclear on the margin of how many more people are dying that they are trying to win on. We say that there is much significant higher degrees of ethnic conflict when you have many different groups vying for power and influence. Note that because they are doing so for religious reasons, they fight very hard and very violently because they believe that their cause is righteous. Humam says, oh, like they're not going to kill other Muslims because they think it's haram. Even if this is true, they probably don't think these people are real Muslims because they're not following their version of like the prophets that they believe in or the right way that they believe you should live your life truly in that way. We think these ethnic conflicts, based on the ties that they tell us about, are much stronger and much more likely, which leads to high levels of death. We think the deaths we get on our side of the house are just better.
Is this
I don't know.
got something gnarly for us,
Huh?
You got something gnarly for us.
That's all.
Look at the flip bar. I can't compliment. Unzip it.
Yeah, it was.
Sorry, in case you guys didn't, I'm gonna switch the washroom, that's why I was. As I didn't tell them. I think I'm just like in a case right now. Yeah. Okay, two very fun pushes from CG. First, that smaller organizations are less violent. I know OG tries to make this push, but they seriously lack the sauce here in terms of explaining what the decision-making calculus actually fucking is and the ways that they tend to react. Notably, we're going to talk about why the threats to these groups are higher and why incentive-wise they're probably prioritizing the appealingness that they have to the populace and the buy-in that they have to the extent to which there are probably fewer risks to people on the ground. Second, we're going to prove that like smaller organizations are much easier to deconstruct with counterinsurgency. Also, OG tries to run this, but they far like way too much resort to empirics. And I think I just notably want to establish the paradox of attacking like a lot of consolidated like insurgencies here, right? Which is that when there is an attack, you need to completely like fucking derail the extent to which this insurgency can operate to some extent, because when they survive, the state response is probably seen as disproportionate and legitimizes the continued threat of violence. At that point, you either need to delegitimize the basis for a lot of these sorts of things sociopolitically in terms of like regaining like sort of faith and control within these institutions so that people don't resort to terrorism in the first place, or when you're using the strategy of literally attacking them with like strong counterinsurgencies, you need to make sure that the devastation is good enough to the point at which they are not operating at the same scale following this. Okay, first, why are they developing like insurgent organizations, especially like important / easier to target on our side? One, we think they're probably far more vulnerable to defeat insofar as they're probably under-disciplined, disorganized, and untrained to some extent, but also just like information control is probably easier for the survival of these newly formed sort of things, right? But that means that detection in a lot of cases for these places is a death sentence, right? It means that you can very easily sort of like crush a lot of the basis for which it happens. The implications here and the reason for why this is important is because given that like a lot of these sorts of insurgencies are developing in like, I don't know, places with limited like governing capacity or like regions that have limited sort of like state presence in a lot of places, like rural like or like mountainous places, I think they need to limit their use of like needless violence at birth because it increases a strong like risk of detection in a lot of cases. And this is also why they're not going to be the fucking Boko Haram in most cases, where they extrajudicially just like will assassinate people or fucking like torture people, because it is a very risky strategy when you get cracked down on, right? But notably, they're probably far more worried about recruitment for important reasons over like the consolidated ones. One, they generally need these sorts of, they need local civilian and population support to the extent to which governments are also competing for this, notably for things like material sort of interests, like food, water, shelter, those things. They need civilians to not collaborate with law enforcement that also exists within this region, so they have to establish some trust. Three, they just need like general sort of like, I don't know, civilian like information to some extent. So what that means that they need to like know like what security is doing. They need to know like, I don't know, like when sort of like raids are happening. They need to like be able to like coordinate around these things. And so what that means that they need to displace the existing support that exists for governments to some extent. And the way in which they're probably going to do this, or the way in which they kind of cater themselves, are probably either like ideological, resource-based, like when it comes to like food and like access to like medication. They probably have like some presence of things like security, right? So what that means is that like, I don't know, when they're promising that they can protect you from danger, they're far less likely to act like organizations like, I don't know, the Viet Cong, where they like bait like the like Americans to like launch an airstrike against like a non-compliant village and then offer to protect them, right? Because they don't have the scale to do a lot of these things. But notably, a lot of the other justifications are pretty weak. There's obviously a harm, even if you're like, I don't know, impoverished, to just join an insurgency. And I think even just like, I don't know, most sort of like ideological grievances are very widespread, but the point at which you're probably likely to join an insurgency to like actualize this is the point at which the government infrastructure is so weak, and the consolidation means that these are legitimate and have enough buy-in to the point where like a lot of this stuff happens in the first place. So notably, I think what that means then is that they're far more likely to join these insurgencies when they're like extremely vulnerable to the point where like the government has like no buy-in, compared to a consolidated version that has a degree of legitimacy or a threat, and to the point at which this is established as a force against the government and is often trusted beyond that, right? But secondly, I think it's far easier then to do like counterterrorism with consolidated groups. And the reason for why this is easier is because of like because when you have selective sort of usage of things like, I don't know, extremely violent forces, right? Or yeah, I think they're much more likely to be effective, because a medium degree of violence or just like some degree of violence often doesn't work, because the like anti-insurgent like effort or like the counterterrorism probably at the very least increases the degree of recruitment, because it is perceived generally as a disproportionate response that weaponizes state power against like a lot of these like insurgent groups, to the extent at which like I don't know, a lot of like these groups use to like gain legitimacy in that way, right? But what that means is that when the insurgency is like notably small, they are so devastated to the point at which they can't then reoperate and like use that legitimacy gain to like work, right? But secondly, it makes it much easier then to like build up like a lot of sort of like economic institutions, like re-enshrining faith within like the established infrastructure to the point at which like I don't know, you're probably far more incentivized to use these strategies to just deal with like the extent to which people want to join a lot of these organizations in the first place, rather than when the consolidation is at like a far greater scale, where like it is like the underlying legitimacy of that organization in and of itself is probably significantly worse, right? The problem here then is that I think the way in which you're probably going to then attack like a lot of these cases is that one, I think most of these vulnerable like groups are far more likely or prone to like defeat in their development, but early stage sort of counterterrorism is like very difficult in case. Yeah, I'll take the way.
Yeah, if these fractured insurgent groups were as small as your case requires to work, then consolidating them literally wouldn't be a huge deal and you'd just be able to take them out.
No, okay, I'm not saying they're fucking tiny. I'm saying there are existing governments that they're competing with. At the point at which they are consolidated, these become predominant. These become the predominant sort of like thing that is spot into. I think at the point at which you're cracking down, it is often seen as like disproportionate, and you vindicate a lot of these sort of like problems that they have. At the point at which you do crack down on our side of the house, it is far easier to just devastate these sorts of things. It is far easier to justify or weaponize that crackdown to the second to that extent, right? But three, I think just given like things like I don't know, terrain problems and like the ability like, and OG just explains like, oh yeah, well these just exist in like urban infrastructure now. But the structural reason for a lot of this is just that the capacity to like exist among like civilian populations and like trust the extent to which local like civilians will like either rat you out or like give you like the routes that people are like patrolling requires a degree of buy-in into the like counterinsurgency to the point at which it has to be consolidated, and it is not like small enough to the point where it has a competing government force that also has buy-in from people generally, right? So that means that when there are like when counterinsurgency it happens in a far more productive way. You're far easier able to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants in these areas, and I think when you rely on infantry, it becomes significantly better. Very proud to propose.
I'll take POIs. Actually, it doesn't matter. No one's online. I will take POIs. I've died because one of the USB-C. Oh, grab the one in the wall. I don't know whose it is, but I've been using it.
I'm strategic to give it and it's waiting 2 seconds.
Our case is going to engage very cleanly with the CG claims because our argument and our main extension for you is that these groups are going to be less radical and more violent when they are larger and involve more like smaller consolidated groups. I'm going to give you just one quick intuition pump for this. I think this is basically like a political party's motion in disguise. When you have smaller, more fragmented political parties, they're more likely to be extreme. When you have one large big tent party, they're more likely to combine different people's views to be more centrist, which we think is probably good in the case of terrorist organizations. And I want to just flag one really important implication of our case, which is that I think it just applies in more circumstances than both of the opening cases. Because note that if you are fighting against the state, our case applies. You are going to do this in a less violent way. If the state is fighting back against you because they see you as a threat, they're going to do it in a better way if they are not threatened as badly because your violence isn't as extreme. And if you're fighting against other terrorist groups, you also do this in a better way on our side of the house when you are a little bit less radical. And so crucially, this is not contingent on proving that more or less infighting and or state capture happens. It applies regardless in more cases, which I think means that we're pretty clearly winning if we can prove this over both opening teams. Now, opening government tells you that sometimes these terrorist groups do coups, take over the state. We agree. We think this is actually fine, right? Firstly, it's unclear why the state is actually better in a lot of cases. Like often these are like military dictatorships. They literally like crack down on civilians all the time. It's unclear why any one crackdown is worse than another. But secondly, I think even if the state is marginally better, I think it's probably preferable to have the strongest military in the state be the one that like runs the government, because then you do not have a weak state trying and failing to fight these groups and prolonging the conflict, you have a stronger terrorist group that just does a coup, takes over the government, and at least successfully provides some amount of security for civilians. We think this is preferable. Okay, getting that into our case, I've got 7 mechanisms for you why these larger groups are going to be less radical and less violent, right? Firstly, I think in a lot of cases, they are just less desperate. When your back is up against the wall and you feel like everything is an existential threat, I think you're much more likely to not think through your plans as clearly, to react with disproportionate violence because you are constantly trying to protect yourself and guarantee your survival. I think when you don't have that same sense of existential threat, you don't react as badly. Secondly, though, I think you're capable of more precise and targeted attacks, which mean, yes, maybe you're still assassinating some American diplomats or French soldiers. This is totally fine insofar as you probably have precision rifles that can target these people instead of machetes to just go after the wedding and hope you catch someone. And so I think when you have more better precise technology, you're able to target your attacks better, which means fewer civilian casualties. We think this is probably preferable. Secondly, though, I think often you actually have something invested, you successfully captured a lot of territory, you successfully staged a coup, you have something to lose, which makes you actually quite risk averse. When you have stockpiles of resources, when you have land, when you have people that already believe in you, you are not willing to jeopardize these with risky all or nothing radical violent strategies. This is why typically it's the smallest groups that are the most violent and radical. Once you control a state and you actually have something invested in it, you have pretty strong incentives to try to resolve things in other ways. Secondly, though, I think that the cost-benefit analysis just changes once to some extent you have consolidated your power. And note that in a lot of places, groups like Boko Haram control large swathes of territory where they are basically effectively acting as the state. Once you have consolidated your power, the cost-benefit analysis of violence is just not worthwhile. It's expensive to spend money and ammunition and political capital literally assassinating civilians. Instead, you could just get legitimacy by effectively imposing Sharia law and making sure nobody can get divorced. We think this is probably preferable. This becomes the easiest way for you to keep your power in state. I also think, though, you get legitimized by providing security, literally per CG's mechanism. This applies symmetrically. All of these groups get buy-in from their members by saying, we're going to protect you from threats. This means that you have strong incentives regardless to protect your members from violence. When you have more members, this is fewer people against whom you can commit violence, especially when they're more regionally concentrated and you don't have smaller other diverse ideological groups. Secondly, though, I think ideologically, you just actually get less radical for 2 main mechanisms. Firstly, you are not competing against other groups to the same extent. When there are lots of different terrorist groups and you're all trying to say that you are the true one, that you have the exclusive right to commit jihad against these other groups, you have to be the most extreme. You have to justify to your followers why your ideology is correct. And you have to explain why not just, the French and the Americans, but also the other groups are infidels that they should not be joining. This justifies a lot of these fights. But I also think these ethnic and regional divisions that OG talks about are part of the problem here. It's like competing gangs in Latin America. When there are lots of different groups you can join, you and your family all join the same gang and then your neighbors join the other one. And it becomes not just an ideological dispute, but also one based on history. They killed my father, I'm going to kill this guy's son. And it goes back and forth for generations. When you consolidate this and you have one larger group, as we see the trend has been, I think you see substantially fewer of these small incidents that can escalate. Finally, though, when you just merge many groups, you have to reconcile the ideas of the different positions. You probably have a couple of competing interpretations of scripture within your group. You have to some extent, be a little bit more ideologically diverse because you have to justify why it's okay for you to absorb this other terrorist group into your own. And I think it's often more efficient just to say actually God's kind of cool with these 2 different interpretations rather than to literally murder every single member of the other group, because that would be expensive, make people mad, make people scared, and waste all your ammunition. And so strong incentive, no thank you, to diversify your group's ideology, which I think means you're less motivated then to impose this in the worst political ways. Finally, though, I think when you get large enough, you actually just hit the critical mass that enables you to get legitimacy by providing some pseudo-state services. So adjudicating legal disputes. Obviously, you're probably not providing childcare, but when people have conflicts, they come to the strong man in the community that can say, you were wrong, you need to give that guy back his land or whatever, which I think does help to begin to improve life for civilians. What are the implications for this? Why do we win? really, really clearly. Firstly, I think that you just get less violence within these groups when they're fighting the state, when they're fighting other communities. They do it in more effective, more targeted ways. I think they're less likely to resort to violence in the first place because they're now more risk averse, which means fewer people die. And crucially, all the people living in areas administered by these groups, I think, get better access to justice, more security, and are less likely to die of conflict or die of famine. OO is able to say terrorists stop killing each other all that much. They literally tell you terrorist deaths don't matter. We tell you why civilian deaths happen to a substantially smaller extent. And if we flip the CG case, I think OG is incredibly out of this round. Very proud to post.
Yeah.
Hello?
Are we calling the next thing?
Yeah. Panel, Namai gives the most important speech in this round because he's the only person that tells you why smaller groups have the incentive to reach out in better ways, and we think no other team is able to deal with this conception. I'll start with our front half, then OO, then CO. Front half suffers from the knows too much curse because they don't provide enough links. Essentially, by the end of the case, they say two things. The first is that consolidation threatens state power because it threatens sovereignty, co-ops Islam, does terrorism, and is large, which leads to more violent state intervention. Their impact is just less intervention is better. But we think terrorism as a whole is still bad. Under their take of this case, we could have similarly oppressive small insurgencies that just harm people on the ground, and they don't provide a reason for why this is necessarily better than the alternative. The second thing that they essentially say is that larger groups are more brutal in terms of recruitment because they're distant from the ground and two, are able to share resources. But they don't tell us about their incentives. What does it mean to not be engaged on the ground, other than the fact that your headquarters are just somewhere else? We think their significant lack of links means that Namai is able to fill a significant amount of those gaps and take it over them. OO says three main things. The first is that consolidation means that you can fight targeted leaders and supply chain weak points, and it's just less hidden. But we think the alternative is that you just need to fight less, because Namai tells you something really important, which is that these smaller groups are inherently less violent. They develop in places with limited state presence and don't want to be discovered. They want to delegitimize the state and prepare institutions to protect people and offer value. There's a high barrier, he illustrates, to convince people to join. So when people do end up joining smaller, less consolidated groups, this means a few things. First, that rhetoric has to happen under a pragmatic basis. They're less historically and religiously entrenched. And second, importantly, this means that states have the potential to reach them through negotiation by offering a better alternative or by offering alternate support systems for the civilians that have the potential to be reached out to. This also means that because of the geographies, it's much more easy to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. What this means against this argument is that just because there are targeted leaders and supply chain weak points doesn't mean that this institution as a whole is more weak. It means it's more able to funnel all of these resources into convincing people to join their organizations as quickly as possible through often dogmatic and repressive, more rhetorically strong means, whereas smaller groups are less susceptible to that and thus more able to de-radicalize people and get them to like participate in the state, for example. The next thing that they say is that there is more violence pre-consolidation because you have to find advantages where you can. We agree with the second part of this, which is that these smaller groups want to find advantages, but we disagree that violence for these groups is the most strategic way to do that. We think rather they're likely to reach out through means that protect people. If you are just like killing people, think about this empirically, like you're not going to succeed in motivating people to join these groups. Rather, because they often operate in dense, like mountainous areas in many cases where there just isn't a lot of state resources. Think not a lot of state resources against like protection from the natural environment, first of all, but also things like industry, like protection from crime, like getting retribution for things that happen to you in your community. They're often more likely to be incentivized to build state institutions that help people, whereas larger groups are less likely to do that and more likely to repress people through their many branches and arms extending throughout those geographies. Second, there isn't more violence pre-consolidation because a lot of these pre-consolidated groups also operate in just like geographically different areas and don't want to be discovered by large clashes that happen. The last thing that they tell you is that consolidation makes these groups less effective because there is bureaucracy and slow decision-making within Al-Qaeda. I think this is untrue. I think this slow decision-making process maybe means that they can't react as quickly in military skirmishes, but it makes them streamlined, which makes it harder for negotiations to happen. The reason it's streamlined and not messy is because these large organizations become dictatorial and follow a rigid religious hierarchy. So it's not like a political party and it's not like a business in the sense that there are many different opinions and they're all valued. We think because of the uniqueness of the fact that they want to establish their own state and there's religious concerns, that is to say, like, if you don't follow the correct version of this doctrine, you're going to like bad places and you won't get like the promised things in eternity. That means there's really high things at stake, and that means they're likely to align with the power structures that exist within these organizations, and that means people are more likely to join these organizations and stay in them. Yeah.
Small insurgencies require secrecy. How can it be easier to delineate between combatants and non-combatants and effectively fight insurgents and not civilians when insurgents are disguised within the civilian population for secrecy?
It's two things. And the first is that you don't need to fight. So in cases where you can't distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, you just reach out to people by building state institutions like Heart and Mind and just make sure that they join those legitimized institutions instead. In cases where there is violence, let's say there's isolated violence in a geographic territory, then it's much easier to identify which side is the like oppressor, and like when you want to target these insurgency efforts, it's much more easy to do so. Whereas if you have a large organization, they're operating through both dogmatic and like violent means, and it's much harder to deal with them that way. BACAF says these groups are less radical, that consolidated groups are less radical and more violent for a few mechanisms. The first one that they say is that they are less desperate. We think desperation means less stability, which means they're more likely to react to negotiations. A less desperate organization is much more able to organize their efforts, and that means they're less receptive to both like deviations in terms of the members and also in terms of governments trying to reach out. Second, they say they have more precise attacks. But we think the brunt of the harm is not through attacks, right? The reason Al-Qaeda is bad is not because they've like the drone strikes, it's because they're involved with drug trade, with human trafficking, with sex trafficking, with harming the most vulnerable populations of a community. Whereas when you're a smaller organization, you first have less capacity to do that, but also you have more incentive to not do those things because you don't have the consolidated power and legitimacy yet. So you're more likely to want to engage people through pragmatic means. Third, they say there's more to lose. We think the smaller communities also have stuff to lose because they're dominant in their geographies and want to, for their survival incentive, incentivize people to align themselves with that community. Fourth, they say they're legitimized by providing security, but we think most of that security goes to protecting higher ups because there is now a rigid hierarchy in those locations. So the fact that you're not engaging with people in actual like isolated geographies, as Namai illustrates to you, means you're less likely to care about the more vulnerable members of your community and actually invest in protecting each one of them. You're much more likely to invest in things like organizing who you're going to drone strike, and that means you provide less security to people on the ground. Fifth, they say ideologically, they're less radical because there's no competition. But we think there is competition. They're competing against the West, against Christianity, against folk religions within the region of this debate. And we think that is still something that they use and continuously use to bolster their presence. Whereas when you're a smaller and local organization, obviously you're not going to be able to convince people just through dogma alone. So you're more likely to reach out to people. Lastly, they say you have to reconcile ideas. We think that's not true. You can often grow through violence, through economic power, through gathering all of the smaller institutions that have consolidated and reaching into those networks those ways. And diversified ideology just looks like the most radical ideas because bonding over hatred is much more easy than bonding over a shared agreement, especially if those regions are so different. We think Namai takes this round.
Oh, I'd like a chair. Okay.
Oh, you got baited into talking about Burkina Faso for 30 seconds by Anais in a POI. Goated. Okay, cool. First, 2 round-winning contributions out of CO. 1, radicalism. Anais gives you 7 mechanisms for this. You're less desperate. You have more precise attacks. You have something to lose. Ideologically, you have to justify why your ideology stands. You verge many groups, which means you have to reconcile. You have to compete on things like interpretation of the scripture. The illustration out of Anais here, specifically of things that are incredibly important to people, like their scriptural interpretations, is the necessary illustration for the necessity of reconciliation, the necessary illustration of why you get less radicalism on our side of the house. But the harms here are not just that you get less infighting per OO, but it's that intra-insurgent warfare, things like the Macina Liberation Front, create high collateral damage among civilians. And the reason is not just because you have more fighting, it's because you don't have money or plans. So random, untargeted, and uncontrolled violence with things like homemade bombs, which are super randomized, are unpredictable, and you get a lot more civilian casualties. This is bad. Also, these fragmented groups with no money turn towards things like banditry, turn towards things like human trafficking and resource looting because they need survival funding. They don't have the resources that you have on your side of the house, and as such, they are desperate. They need to buy guns, they need to buy food, they need to stay alive. You get the worst excesses of harm on our side of the house. Wang over OO, their case is on relative stability. This is the only chance I'll give you for a POI go.
Yeah, so no AQIM has proven why consolidation is peaceful and not just the end of infighting between these groups. How moderate was ISIS when they controlled half of Iraq?
Great, I'll get to your case later. No op teams have proved consolidation is more peaceful. If we prove the comparative is more radical, presumably the opposition is more peaceful. Lock in. Okay, we prove OO's case is on relative stability. They explain why more people get caught in conflict, and so in such on their side, there's far less to fight about. I think we prove with much more rigor why you get the worst excesses of radicalism for the 7 mechanisms. And as such, we tell you that you get worse harms, and the types of harms are desperate and are funded by poverty-stricken groups who have no money. They're less likely to do that. We have more certainty on infighting, more certainty on civilian casualties. That's our weighing over OO. Cool. A lot on OG. The main contributions, 1, is that you get more death associated with security deaths. But unfortunately, Carl gets lost in the sauce here, and the debate meta takes him out. They haven't mechanized the incentives for France, their actors, to actually go in. Their mechanism is that the consolidation is a threat to the state power of Sahel. But Sahelian governments are already losing legitimacy. Consolidation isn't what is creating this legitimacy. Things like failed government, poverty, and corruption do this, maybe more and just as much. The huge gap then is, why is France incentivized to go in? Because France's state power is not threatened. It's not about France. So if France is going in as per their factual claims, it means, I'd imagine, it's not about whether or not Burkina Faso's state power is staying strong because there's relatively smaller groups attacking them. France is smart enough to know that their interference is not going to succeed in stabilizing Burkina Faso's government insofar as there's all these other factors I've explained to you, please stop, on why they're likely to succeed on either side of the house. The implication of this ref is foreign interference is incentivized on both sides of the house. France interferes for many other reasons, pre-existing agreements, etc., maybe land, whatever. But their case is on comparative insofar as they fuck up on mechanizing it. So now what you get when France goes in is not only that it's uncomparative, we flip this because it's going better. You go in better when you know more because you have better negotiation. The better counterterrorism has followers. When you have a targeted leader who is more centralized and visible and easier to take down, cross-apply OOs, compelling mechs on why it's more visible to see these leaders, you're able to do things like negotiate with them and talk to them, to do things like get back hostages, and you're also able to do things like kill important leaders. But OO says this, but OG points out then, I have no clue why killing a leader will stop terrorism. One, you can kill the leader and then pay off and bribe some new guy to stand in your place. This is probably good. But more importantly, I'll explain why it's better to dismantle a terrorist group systemically. States might not have the best capacity for counterterrorism in this form, but they have value protections and resources which can help negotiation. Freeing hostages is certainly good because we save innocent civilians, you signal weakness in terrorist groups, and instill more trust in the state who has taken out people. This is good. But it's better to dismantle them systemically because often these groups are entrenched in communities such that foreign interference is really hard. You have a lot of civilian casualties. So when you can do things like negotiate with the heads, when you can do things like understand the intel better, this can stick better because you have more reinforcing mechanisms to checks and balances on these types of harms. You need this. Cool. Okay, awesome. A few more extraneous points of ref I won't take you. Smaller indiscriminate groups are less powerful. They don't actually prove a tipping point on the war people coming in. I don't know how small these groups have to be for France to pull out, and I don't know if they are that small. Presumably if France has an incentive to go in, they have an incentive to go in up to a certain point. I have no clue where. Also, Sahelian governments are not the ones cracking down. Carl wants this to be the case, but they haven't proven the capacity for crackdowns. I have no clue why they're prioritizing this, particularly when governments are corrupt. They often work alongside these groups or would rather spend money on other things that are more likely to get success. Also, any counter-terrorist measures on your side of the house, you have to kill 25 leaders. We have to kill one leader and get it right one time. The thing about local connections, the word consolidations means you have homies you're fucking consolidating with. I don't know who's moving all around such that you have all these local harms. These people are just consolidating on their ideas such that now they're connected but they're staying in their relative places. Their point on strengthening groups is beaten by radicalism and less awful harms. On CG, they think smaller organizations are less violent, but they tell you that smaller groups are regionally dominant. If they're regionally dominant, they'll be just as good as drug trafficking, etc. if that's what you care about on their side of the house. They also fall to all of our analysis on why you're likely to be extremely radical, incentivized to do the worst kinds of harms, and you have the only capacity to do the worst kinds of harms on our side of the house. I do not buy their case. I think it's very important that we protect the most innocent people, we protect civilians, we stop terrorism best. Proud of CO.
They're close.
Yes.
I think you saw it.
Okay.